I became fascinated by the array of seaweed species that exist. There's 12,000 species to choose from, but maybe only a couple dozen are commercialized. So if we were to really start exploring seaweed in depth, would we find untapped potential to solve for these really wicked problems that we see in industry?
Hey, Erum, what's going on?
Oh, wow. It's been a little chaotic today. Today is a snow day here in New York City, which I love the snow, but for me, that means my toddler's at home. So if anyone hears any disruption throughout this, you'll know why.
Yeah, I mean, it's the first snow day New York City has had in a long time. They actually closed the schools. They were expecting like 6 to 8 inches. And I woke up this morning at 6, it was still raining. And then when I looked out at 7, there was about half an inch of snow. It's still coming down pretty heavy though.
Yeah. I'm excited to go sledding and relive some of the fun snow day. Although the New York Department of Education said that the days of off snow days are over because they are encouraging kids to go to school from home. They still have to go to class virtually. I guess the older kids for sure. So that kind of sucks. I'm glad that there wasn't an internet back in my day.
Kristen is a school teacher, so the teachers are doing remote school today. So even though they're at home, and she was excited about that, she is teaching from home. That is something that is happening. Kids are still in school despite the mini storm. But you went out last night. You went to an event. I did not go. What was the event you went to and what was exciting about it?
The event was hosted by DeSci NYC. So DeSci is short for Decentralized Science, and they promote collaborative research on the blockchain. The founder of DeSci NYC is Michael Fisher. He's the founder of DBDAO, which is a database. And we'll be talking about what DAOs are more. It stands for Distributed Autonomous Organization, really changing the way organizations can be structured and how data and transactions can be managed through blockchains and how IP can be protected through NFTs. So it's very refreshing to see alternative approaches to the way we do business. That's something that you and I are very interested in when it comes to biotechnology. Last night's event was about longevity. They had an amazing speaker, Karl. I wish you were there. His name is Siraj Raval, and he's a computer engineer. He actually dropped out of school because he's a genius and he just needed to practice his trade versus learning more and more about it because things were not going as fast in university as they were in real life. But what he did, he sold his genome as an NFT for one Ethereum token, I guess, or coin, I guess you can say. And he talked about why he did that. He's very interested in synthetic biology. He did a great talk about what synthetic biology is to this group. He's really trying to underscore the intersection between cryptocurrency, AI, and biological data. So there's so many applications that are waiting to be created, and it's exciting to talk about it. There was a lot of young people. I would say I was at least average 15 years, 20 years older than most of the people there, but they're all students, and they're asking amazing questions. It's something that we will deep dive into in a few episodes from now with Albert Annis of Valley DAO, which is another organization focused on research and collaboration that's decentralized. There's no governing body. It's a different universe that we're going to be exploring.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if people want to kind of get a preview into what decentralized science or DeSci is, we did an interview with Ari Littman, part of LabDAO, that you can look at on the Messaging Lab website. We actually did it before we started this podcast. So it's in our blog. If you're interested, we'll make sure there's a link in the notes. But we also did an interview with Jocelyn Pearl, who's very involved in the DeSci space. I had gone to an early blockchain/Bitcoin event, probably in the early 2010s. And it was one of the most diverse crowds I've ever been around. Yes, it was mostly guys because it was finance related, but there were guys who were like in their 80s and kids who were barely out of diapers. That's what it felt like. That was the range of people that wanted to learn about blockchain in the early 2010s. Here we are 10 years later, and there's a lot going on in the world of cryptocurrency. There's a new exchange traded fund and ETF that's trading Bitcoin. There's a Bitcoin halving, which happens every 4 years. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's very interesting. And then what happens after Bitcoin halves is you have a so-called DeFi summer. which means anything that is related to cryptocurrency that is not Bitcoin or Ethereum tends to get a lot of investment. So I'm kind of curious in terms of this guy, Siraj, how much Ethereum was worth when he sold his genome for 1 ETH, because Ethereum is now, I think, in the $2,500 range. But I know at one point it was very, very cheap. So very curious about that.
Yeah, he sold his genome for 1 Ethereum as an NFT, and it was sold twice already. And he's made money off of each of those transactions. And the whole idea basically is that everyone should put their own genomes and the data on the blockchain so they can track who's using it and make money off of it as it's used. So if pharmaceutical companies want different array of genomic data from different types of people, sure, they can just pay for it on the blockchain to just buy it, and then everyone makes money versus just shady ways. For example, not shady, but 23andMe, I've done it. They have my genomic information. They can sell that data to pharmaceutical companies, but I'm not making any money off of that, which seems unfair.
It's interesting that you're bringing up 23andMe because they've been a little bit in the news lately because their value has dropped almost or more than 90% since its peak. At its peak, I think the company had a stock price of about $18, and I bet it's probably under $1 right now. So they're having a hard time, even though their model initially was they were trying to just collect genetic information. Then they weren't making any money from that. And so then they started to sell that information to the pharmaceutical industry. But I think there must have been something funky about their model. I think it's something we should dig into. And maybe we should try to get them here on the podcast to talk about it.
Yeah, because that was the first thing. And I was thinking about with what Siraj has done is like, well, if we do decentralize and democratize individual genomic information to empower people to share it with pharmaceutical companies, there is no need for a 23andMe. So I wonder if the stockholders of 23andMe started seeing a trend, or they see the writing on the wall and they're like, let's just cash out now before shit hits the fan.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super good question because you would think that they were early. I remember they got shut down because they were making claims about their data, probably in the mid 2010s. I was at a startup at that point, and I was part of a discussion about this. And it was a very heated discussion because there were people who were saying, they should not be regulated. They should be able to say whatever the hell they want about their data. And there was certain data that they used to put behind a paywall that would reveal if you had some kind of genetic disease or if you're carrying 2 genes for Alzheimer's, which I am, by the way. So you had to agree. And my biggest contention with 23andMe was that most people don't understand what that information means. It's as simple as they presented it. Most people don't understand that if you carry 2 genes for Alzheimer's, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get Alzheimer's. It just means you carry those 2 genes. And there's things you can do to prevent that from happening, which I do or try to do. So anyway, we should try to get them on the podcast, see if they'll talk to us about what's up.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really interesting things going on in that space that we will continue to explore. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning, last week as Messaging Lab, we did a session for the Merck Digital Studio cohort. We've done this before. We basically talked about fundraising, communications, and strategy to this group of startup founders. It was a very engaging talk. So shout out to our friend Hamdi who set that up for us. I thought it went really well. What do you think, Erum?
Yeah, the Merck Digital Sciences Studio is an amazing program for people that are interested in biopharma and making the tools to accelerate drug development and clinical trials. The companies are so impressive, Karl. I mean, we were looking at what they were doing, and the founders, yes, they were engaged and had very specific challenges and questions that I really appreciated. They are thinking about how do we communicate our technology, our company, to the pharmaceutical industry that's been around for lots of years. A lot of people that work in pharma have been there for like 10, 20, 30 years. And when you're at a company for that long, it's hard to necessarily think about innovation and how do you integrate it into what is a well-oiled machine to make the machine more efficient. So it was just very interesting to read about the companies and talk to them about fundraising. Talk to them, how do you get investor funding? So I'm excited to share the post on LinkedIn because I've had some thoughts about this because of my previous experience fundraising. And thank you, Karl. You always encourage me to write more. So I will be posting about how to find your ideal investor on my LinkedIn.
Awesome.
But you've been busy. I know that you had an opportunity to bring biology to students. What were you up to?
So I haven't actually done it. By the time this podcast airs, I'll have co-taught a seminar at Pratt to the seniors in biocentric design. Our friend Aaron Nesser, who is a co-founder of Keel Labs, who make thread from algae. He and I will be teaching to a senior group. It's their capstone seminar, and the two of us are going to go in, talk about our careers, talk about what's interesting in the materials world and how people are using biodesign to change the environment we live in. So I'm excited about that. I'll report back because I find that going to colleges, universities, and high schools, that's where you get the hardest questions. It's like you said about this DeSci New York, you felt like the oldest person in the room. I'm a little older than you, so I'm definitely always the oldest person in the room. But you also gave another talk, or you're part of a panel with an alternate materials organization in Bangalore, right?
Yeah. We've been going hard on the alternative material space, Karl. Between you going biofabricate, between today's conversation, which we'll get into in a minute, there's an organization, like you mentioned, called Terrarium. They focus on alternative materials, so biomaterials and not bio, but still they've developed materials in a sustainable approach. It was a real conference, and I beamed in virtually. I was on a panel with Schmieder Venkatraman, and she's a senior director of marketing at Ginkgo Bioworks. So Ginkgo Bioworks is the organism engineering company. We've mentioned them a few times. We've had people from their companies. We interviewed Cass Smith from Ginkgo, which is one of our highest rated episodes called Dreaming in Biology. It's worth a listen. But what we talked about really is they asked us questions about what's going on in the US, what types of innovations are you seeing? I think mainly because we support a lot of companies in the space. We also interviewed them on the podcast, so they wanted some perspective. Also, with our experience with entrepreneurs, Karl, you and I, we both have our own experiences starting companies. And there was a big question that came up, which we'll dig into more later because this is a big topic. But the question that someone brought up was they're a founder of a biomaterials company. They're always grappling with, should they create an end product or should they create a platform for businesses? And the businesses can leverage their infrastructure and their proprietary technology or formulation, whatever it is, to build out their own products. So that's always the big question that founders have when they're making something from scratch that's like a technology is that do we create a product or do we create a platform?
And where did you end up on whether you should create a platform or a product? What's your take on this, Erum?
It always depends on what type of company you are. And for materials, I really pointed to examples from other companies that we've seen that I think are doing it right. So I gave the example of C16, Shara and her team. They are replacing palm oil. We interviewed Shara on this pod, one of the first 10 episodes. What they're doing is they've discovered a unique yeast strain that could produce biosimilar palm oil. Palm oil is in all these foods. It's in all these beauty products. So they created an oil for skin and hair to prove to the beauty industry that this is what it looks like and we're going to sell it. So they did what we call a fermentation run. So they first created a batch of the oil and then they bottled it up in this beautiful bottle. There's just a limited series of this beauty oil made from their yeast strain and it was all sold out. And they did it again, but with soap. They made a soap bar in collaboration with Pangaea, who we also had on this podcast, and a department store in the UK, completely sold out. So they're making products to prove to the industry what their platform can do. They work with B2B companies and they sell their platform or I guess the oil or the technology directly to them. So I think it's a mixture of both, but in the end, platforms can retain the big bucks because if you're selling directly to consumers, it's hard to keep them buying, but it's easier to create a 3-year contract with company. That's where I stand.
Yeah, interesting. I stand on the product side, even if you're building a platform. And we have almost burned through the whole bottle of the palmless oil. And so I'm waiting for Shara and her team to put out another limited edition so we can buy more. I think it's worth just saying, you mentioned it, we seem to have been on a nice biomaterials run here at Grow Everything. Today's episode is going to, again, focus on biomaterials.
Yeah, we are interviewing Julia Marsh of Sway. And you met Julia at Biofabricate. What was that interaction like?
Yeah, you're right, Erum. I saw Julia at Biofabricate. She was one of several companies that are working on alternatives to fossil fuel derived plastics. I was so impressed by what the Sway team is doing that I said, let's invite you on the podcast. So let's have Julia tell us about her company and what they're doing. Julia Marsh, welcome to the Grow Everything podcast. We're so happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
So we saw you, or at least I did, Erum wasn't there. I saw you present at Biofabricate in Paris. What did you think of that conference?
Loved the curation of innovators, so many interesting feedstocks, which I hope we'll have the chance to talk about. I mean, mycelium certainly was the theme of the event, but there were so many cool materials sourced from cattail fluff and nanocellulose and microalgae and all kinds of different inputs that just really got me inspired.
Yeah, it's a fantastic conference. We did a whole recap episode on it that we just played, and I'm still blogging about it because there were so many things to digest. Erum, I'm sorry you didn't make it this time. You were at Biofabricate for the first time last year or 2 years ago. It feels like it was a while ago, but it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, the big theme that we came away with was it's really nice to feel like you're not isolated in your problems. Biology is so dynamic and we can't always control the outcome. So it was very grounding to feel like other people also feel that challenge.
Right. Yeah. And you come from a super interesting background. You come from brand and packaging design, and you started this company, Sway, which we're going to get into. Tell us the journey from being a packaging designer to starting Sway, which is really a clean tech company.
Well, I think that fundamentally all issues that are facing our planet are design challenges. So while I may not be a biologist, I definitely can look at the system and the complexity of it and find solutions inside of that complexity. I was building, brand and packaging systems for consumer goods brands, design studios, tech companies. And at all of those places, I was partially responsible for sourcing materials. So I know very well why brands continue to work with plastic. I know their shortcomings. I also grew up in California, right next to the ocean. My family worked at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So I understand a lot of the realities, harsh realities of where materials go when we don't manage them well.
That's one of my favorite places in the world, the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
It's so beautiful. Never gets old.
Yeah, that is an amazing place.
First of all, hello. It's so great to meet you. I didn't get to go to Biofabricate, but Karl was telling me a lot about you and your work, and it's absolutely necessary. So we all know that traditional plastic packaging is bad for the environment. And you have a very unique perspective on here because you worked with it very intimately. So can you share a little bit more about what are the specific negative impacts do you think people don't understand? Because people know more about that specific garbage patch, but can you share other stories?
Sure. So part of the plastic problem that I'm obsessed with is thin film plastic. It's everywhere in our kitchens, it's in our grocery stores, and it's super affordable, super lightweight, and demand for flexible packaging is only going up. We're interested in solving for this non-recyclable, pervasive kind of plastic with biology, where greater access to a compostable solution might not only solve for plastic waste, but also increase access to composting behavior in general. So hopefully we'll chat about this more, but yeah, flexible packaging, overlooked and a huge opportunity.
Yeah, so talk about the founding of Sway. Your materials are designed to match the performance characteristics of plastic packaging, but they're made from seaweed. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in this podcast is that biology not only offers solutions, but the performance characteristics of biological materials tend to be very different and actually often are better. But give us a history of Sway and what does the process look like of turning seaweed into a flexible plastic look like?
Well, I started with this obsession with the third pillar of the circular economy, which says we've got to regenerate nature. We have to invest in natural systems. What are the viable materials? Where are there natural polymers that have maybe been overlooked or underutilized that qualify for this pillar of regeneration? And this took me down just an amazing learning journey of meeting with folks like Material Connection and chatting with the biolabs at various universities and reading a lot of research papers and becoming obsessed with all the innovative materials featured on Decentralized, and probably what this audience spends a lot of their time doing as well. And what I discovered was seaweed is really rich in natural polymers. I already knew it's cultivated everywhere in the world. And having grown up in California, I know what it does underwater. So it was kind of this perfect aha moment. So seaweed grows everywhere on Earth, on every coastline. It is a super abundant, generous crop. It doesn't require fresh water, it grows in the ocean, doesn't require pesticides. It just thrives in natural ecosystems. And people have been farming seaweed for thousands of years, literally, as a source of food. And there's a commercial industry that most people, definitely the biology community, but most people don't know about. Seaweed's in your toothpaste. It's in your moisturizing cream. It's in your donut glaze. Seaweed is this secret ingredient that is commercially viable, but completely underutilized as a material feedstock for replacements for plastic.
In your research, you're looking for natural resources that have unique properties. Was seaweed the first material that came to your mind, or was there another material that you're like, okay, we could use this, but then all of a sudden you discovered that seaweed could be better? Just curious what the research process was and if there was a process of elimination.
Sure. I became obsessed with every material that fit the criteria of it comes from nature. It gives back through its cultivation process. It had the potential to return nutrients to the earth after it's being used. A lot of us have gone down this path of, oh my gosh, there's mycelium, there's agricultural waste, there's fermentation processes, there's pea protein, there's waste wool, there's coffee grounds. I mean, I really was looking at absolutely every potential resource, and seaweed just continually brought me back to the ocean is often seen as a victim in the climate crisis and in the story around plastics. Shouldn't the solution for plastic come from the ocean? I became fascinated by the array of seaweed species that exist. There's 12,000 species to choose from, but maybe only a couple dozen are commercialized. So if we were to really start exploring seaweed in depth, would we find untapped potential to solve for these really wicked problems that we see in industry? Then I started playing with seaweed on my own in my kitchen. And I thought, if I, with zero technical prowess, can make a plate or a cup out of seaweed, then surely if I go to the plastic industry and I find someone who cares about this issue, I should be able to create a technology that could actually scale.
And what have you found to be the challenges of working with seaweed? Seaweed grows in the ocean. It's a wet plant. It needs the water to survive, salt water. But turning it into a plastic substitute, if I can call it that, must be very challenging. How do you do that?
Yeah, plastic is definitely a well-oiled system. Biology doesn't really necessarily fit into that system, especially seaweed, which is extremely hydrophilic, comes from the ocean, wants to gel. It's not a meltable material. So the challenges have been, how do we work in partnership with the inherent properties of seaweed? How do we help the natural polymers found in seaweed do what they want to do, while also not requiring industry to adapt too much to our solution? And that's been the central point of the past 3 years of research in designing our foundational resin, which is called thermoplastic seaweed. And what we unlocked was the ability to not just enable seaweed to melt, but also to flow and maintain melt strength as it goes through this production process. And along the way, the biggest challenges have been seaweed's looking for moisture. So being able to control that as much as possible has been our biggest focal point.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I seem to remember that you guys, I'm going to say easily, things are all relative, but you easily plug into existing plastic supply chains. Is that true? Do you produce beads that people are used to working with? What's the process to go from seaweed to your product to an end product?
Sure. So seaweed is farmed in the ocean. It's harvested. It's basically like giving the seaweed a haircut, dries on the beach. And then it goes through an extraction process where you separate the biomass from the natural polymer inside, which is agar, alginate, or carrageenan. It's basically a white powder. It looks like flour. And that's what at Sway we work with. We combine it with other plants, starches, sugars to create beads, as you describe them. We call it resin. They're pellets. This is a perfect replication of what the traditional plastic industry uses to make everything. everything, every type of plastic that you're encountering probably most likely came from a little pellet. And this little pellet enables us to go everywhere that plastic goes.
So you kind of started the conversation about thin film plastic. Is that the first application? And why was that the decision to make the thin film plastic?
Yes, so we've really been laser focused on flexible packaging. The reason being, flexible packaging is a huge polluter. It's very unlikely to be recycled. Because of that, most flexible packaging goes to landfill. And in unmanaged landfills, that flexible packaging is very likely to float out into natural spaces where it'll last forever. So we wanted to solve for this extremely difficult challenge of flexible packaging just because composting makes sense in these use cases. Think of retail bags or food packaging, your Snickers bar wrapper, your Cliff bar wrapper, things that are being contaminated with food anyway. Makes sense that they should be compostable and that they should be toxin free. We also had to grapple with this is the actual hardest plastic challenge to solve because the manufacturing process is the most unforgiving. That's the reason it's taken us 3 years to launch our first thermoplastic seaweed product, because it's an extremely, extremely difficult problem, but it has to be solved.
Give us a picture of why this problem is so difficult. Like, I'm imagining a roll of saran wrap. So I'm trying to figure out, what does the process look like to go from these seaweed pellets to a roll of saran wrap? Is that a good analogy?
Yeah, simplified. You take these pellets, you feed them into a hopper, they're melted down, and then they're typically blown into what would be like a chewing gum bubble, except on a massive scale. Some of these processes, the bubble is 12 feet wide or greater, and it's a column that goes up 5 stories. The way that traditional plastic is produced is baffling and honestly pretty depressing when you go and visit these sites. But that's the system we have to optimize for. And we can do it at different stages. But because you're trying to create a bubble, you have to have perfection in terms of the uniformity of the material, how it maintains its melt strength and flow, its ability to cool at the right times. Otherwise, the bubble pops and you lose all that material.
That would be amazing to see. I feel like that's like a Mr. Rogers behind the scenes. Let's go see what this bubble looks like and see it pop or get wrapped into this saran wrap wheel.
Definitely.
That would be awesome to see. Do you guys work on that level or do you partner on that level?
We partner on that level. So our model is we are really the innovation team that creates formulations that can plug into these systems that already exist. The idea and the systems change we're seeking is we don't want to reinvent the wheel. The wheel is functioning very well. What we want to do is swap out the material that's being used. And that's how you get real impact if folks who would otherwise be producing plastic are now able to switch over to biology.
And you said that going to these facilities is depressing. Why?
I highly recommend anyone who thinks that plastic is no longer a problem visit a plastic manufacturing site or a recycling site, because you just don't realize the gravity, the scale of the challenge. And especially plastic manufacturing, it's so efficient. It has been optimized for over 100 years now. It's so efficient at producing mass volumes of this material. If you really want to beat plastic, you have to turn off the tap or you have to play in the same system. The amount of openness that we've received from the plastic industry to work with us has been super reassuring, because if you're working in that plant every day, you also know the gravity of the situation. You know the amount of waste. You know the data. And I think the best way to usher in solutions is to work in partnership with these legacy industries.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
To me, it brings up 2 points. One is, I think it's really important for people to know that trying to replace the infrastructure is probably a futile exercise. So what you're describing to me makes a lot of sense. There's trillions of dollars of infrastructure that have been built over 100 years to produce fossil fuels and turn those fuels into plastics. So being able to plug into those, I think, is key. And the thing that one of the takeaways I had from Biofabricate this year was seeing a number of manufacturers or innovators, including yourselves, where you're producing these pellets that are easy to plug into these existing systems. I've been going to Biofabricates in the beginning. First of all, I had no idea plastic comes from pellets. Maybe I did. But seeing you guys and seeing other innovators say they were producing these pellets from alternate materials just made me go, that's one of the ways we're going to solve this problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm really curious to know, how long has your company been in operation? How many pellets are you guys producing?
How many pellets?
Yeah.
So
the volume of pellets, I guess.
So we were incorporated in 2020. We were a COVID baby right in the middle of the pandemic. We started our operations mainly centered actually on how we would build our supply chain. I knew from my thesis research that seaweed was a viable option to solve plastic, but what I didn't want to do was replicate some of the mistakes that have been made in industrial agriculture. I thought the worst thing would be if we placed all this demand on seaweed. Sway is hugely successful, but then we're harming the ocean in some way. So for the first 6 months of our development, we actually built out our supplier network and relationships with seaweed farms and really wanted to understand what would mass demand mean for the ocean. And turns out it is only net positive for oceans and for coastal communities. As much as we're a material science company, we're equally invested in a thoughtfully designed partnership ecosystem, and that includes the ocean farms. Since 2020 and now in 2024, we've been able to design a foundational technology, scale it to where we're now able to work with massive brands. We won the Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize in 2023, won first place, which meant amazing connections to all kinds of brands included in that early adopter cohort, like J. Crew and Burton, and smaller brands like Le Club and Noah. These are fashion brands that are really seeking solutions. And now our production is centered on producing sufficient volumes to actually address those partners' needs in their existing packaging systems.
Can you talk a little bit more about the partnerships you have with the ocean farms and processors? How do those contribute to scalability and sustainability?
The seaweed farmer is the centerpiece of our efforts outside of material science. We want everything that we do to benefit the seaweed farmer and the ocean, because as you're thinking about this beautiful future that we're designing centered around biology, you cannot omit the human aspect. We want a blue economy to develop, to emerge, where coastal communities only see benefit from our involvement there. And so we've done a lot of coalition building. We work with nonprofits, we work with farms directly, we work with processors. We understand what's happening in the ocean, what's happening on the coastline, and how a young startup can stand to help increase the beneficial properties of seaweed. Some of those beneficial properties include reversing ocean acidification, measuring the contributions of ocean farms to biodiversity, more resilient employment, better wages for coastal communities. So these are all metrics that we're considering when we vet a new partner and build a relationship.
Yeah, I remember someone had said that you could solve a good percentage of the carbon problem by planting a seaweed farm the size of Washington State, because of how regenerative and how much carbon seaweed absorbs and stores. So as I think about what you guys are doing, I remember that statistic. I don't know if that's true. So listeners, correct me.
There was a paper that came out a few years ago suggesting that if you covered 9% of Earth's oceans with seaweed farms, you would nix our entire carbon budget. 9% of Earth's oceans, I think, is something like the size of Australia. It's a huge amount of seaweed that would need to be cultivated. The blue carbon topic, how much seaweed actually sequesters carbon, is variable depending on the species and the region and how it's cultivated, how it's farmed, like the sediment underneath the seaweed. This is a super hot topic in the space right now. Frankly, the science isn't quite there to verify the true potential of seaweed to sequester carbon, but it is a fact that wetlands, and seaweed included on coastlines, do absorb somewhere around 5 times more carbon than land forests. And every other breath that you take is coming from the ocean. Our seaweed's ability to cycle and produce oxygen, sequester carbon is definitely there. And it's something that we're continually better understanding as the science emerges.
So the size of Australia, I have to update my stat to say the size of Australia.
we need to fact check.
So you mentioned the variability of seaweed, and at the top of this conversation, you mentioned there's 12,000 species of seaweed. And a part of this process of converting this seaweed into a plastic substitute. But how did you select the seaweed? How do you ensure that there's consistency, whether it's on the growth side from these seaweed producers versus processing the seaweed? Trying to understand the selection and the consistency in managing that.
We're looking for global availability. So the material needs to be, the natural polymer contained within the seaweed needs to be globally available. We're looking in general for growth cycles that are year round, although we do work with some species that only have one harvest per year. We're looking for certain performance features. Certain strains of seaweed provide better elongation in the finished material to make it more stretchy or have better tensile strength. Some seaweed species provide more rigidness if we want a more stiff product. So it's based on availability, it's based on performance, and then it's also based on impact. So if we know that a certain type of seaweed is going to contribute more to coastal communities or is going to cycle more excess nutrients out of the ocean, we'll give preferential treatment to that species. Right now, we're working with dozens of different types of seaweed because we think the most impact comes from embedding biodiversity into the sourcing strategy, not over-relying on one region, not relying on one type of seaweed, so that we're never in this position that industrial agriculture has found itself where you're producing monocultures and you're really taking more than you're giving through the cultivation process.
How do you think about that on the consumer side or on the big customer side or the buyer of the plastic? Because I think a lot of reason for the monoculturing is to have a consistent product that's being rolled out that consumers are accustomed to. Is this something where you're trying to think of maybe consistency isn't necessary, or is it reformulating using some type of AI algorithm to formulate the seaweed depending on what type is harvested to ensure consistency? I'm trying to reconcile how things are happening today versus how things can be tomorrow.
Sure. I mean, I can only share so much with a public audience, but I'll say that the primary feature we're looking for, the primary one, is gel strength. That's the property inside of seaweed that we're seeking to mimic in our films. As long as we're able to measure that particular feature, there is some room for variability. I would like a future of materials where we can afford some variation because biology naturally contains variability. And in general, the challenge of plastic is that it's over-engineered. It does more than it needs to. Shouldn't our evolved packaging systems be a little bit more forgiving? You don't need a 7-layer film. Most people probably don't know this. When you go and buy your giant toilet paper thing from Costco and it has that plastic packaging around it, that's 7 layers of film that have been severely engineered to fully protect your toilet paper. That's not necessary at all. And so we're trying to kind of undo this way of thinking where everything needs to be uniform and everything needs to prevent the maximum possible impact. There's probably a lot of places where variation is totally fine.
You mentioned that you guys had won this Tom Ford Award, which makes me think of all the plastic that gets associated with packaging clothing. But tell us about some of the other applications. What's closest to market or what's on the market? What can people look for?
So the reason that we started the company was actually to target food packaging. Food contaminates a lot of packaging. It means that it can't be recycled, goes to landfill. I think when we're very successful, the clearest indication of that will be we're packaging Snickers bar wrappers, like Skittles packaging. It's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. But that's a really complicated package to launch with. So where we've started is simpler first applications in fashion, home goods, and beauty. What's available on the market right now are retail boxes with Seaweed windows. We launched a totally clear film that allows for shoppers to see what's inside the box, protects the contents inside, but it's completely bio-based and will compost on a really rapid timeline. And the next products that we'll be launching are poly bags. This is, again, targeted at fashion, home goods, and beauty industries where you need something to protect the product inside. It's got to go through a complicated distribution channel in order to get to the shopper. So unfortunately, some kind of packaging is still needed. These are the wicked, annoying plastics that we're starting with a focus on.
That's actually really interesting, this compost timeline. It's something that we've talked to some of our other clients and other material companies that are creating biomaterials, and they have a measure for that. Even as regulators have a measure of what is biodegradable. I think it has to be decomposed within 60 days. Have you done any studies on thin films that you're making? And you mentioned that you're making this window, which is part of a cardboard packaging. Which one composts faster? The cardboard or your thin film?
Great question. So we go by the gold standard of compostability, which is the TÜV Austria Home Compost Certification. The whole idea being anyone should be able to compost, whether or not you have access to an industrial compost facility. So the TÜV Austria mandate is the material needs to decompose naturally without added heat or any special systems in less than 180 days. Within an industrial compost environment, it's less than 60. So our material passes both of those criteria. Some of our products decompose as fast as 6 weeks. Some require a little bit more time depending on how complicated they are. But they're all going to be home compostable, meaning you could mix it in with your food scraps. You could be in your backyard compost. It can be on your tabletop. It can go in your mill or your loamy. There are all different kinds of avenues for making this material return to biology. And within the box system that we've designed with our partners at EcoEnclose, the paperboard itself and the window coming from Sway are technically compostable. But we think the best use case is that the film is composted, feeds into that system of biological circularity, and that the box is recycled with other papers so that it can turn into additional paper. We haven't run a race against the two, but we could do that in the lab for sure. I think Seaweed might win.
I think Seaweed might win too. I mentioned this at the top of the episode that many of the companies that we've interviewed that have a biomaterial find that there's interesting performance characteristics that, I guess the way I would say it is they're not substitutes for the existing material. I'm thinking of cement or brick. Have you found that there are interesting performance characteristics of the seaweed-based films that you guys are making?
Totally. So the way that we initially approached R&D was the material needs to match or exceed the performance properties of traditional plastic, specifically, flexible plastics. And that makes sense in a lot of places. We do actually have to beat traditional plastic in order to be a viable solution. But there are a lot of places that plastic is over-engineered and where compromise is possible. The first is compostability, of course, but also solubility. So are there places where the material actually in single use cases actually could just resolubilize back into the place that seaweed originally came from? That's an overlooked area for a lot of innovation where, think of your pasta you're purchasing at the store. Maybe it's an easy kit. It's like a mac and cheese, and you literally are buying it and you're immediately making it, and then you're throwing the packaging out very quickly. That's a great place for a soluble film to take place, where you could mix it in with like hot water, it would resolubilize, and actually you'd have no packaging waste to speak of. It would disappear completely. Those are the types of use cases we're starting to explore. Also, it's a conversation we're having with brands where we're trying to understand, what is the real life cycle of this packaging? Does it need to do all the things that you're describing?
So are you implying that potentially your packaging, like I would go buy a pack of ramen and I could just toss the whole package of ramen into the boiling water and it would say that algae would solubilize, maybe add a flavor component to the ramen while the ramen itself cooks?
That's an idea that we're very interested in. I love going backpacking. I spend a lot of time outdoors. And there's this mantra of leave no trace. You really need to be cognizant of the materials that you're bringing into nature. How cool would it be to curate an entire line of packaging that could, solve for the necessary toiletries that you bring on a camping trip, that you could resolubilize them and there would be no harm to nature. I think that kind of thinking is a place where seaweed and its inherent properties can really be taken advantage of.
So in the box system is cardboard, and then you have the thin film window, the seaweed film. Is there any indication or label that it's made from seaweed so the consumer knows that it is?
Super important that the consumer always knows what a material or what a package is made from. And being in this space, I've realized how much communication isn't happening on the materials that we interface with on a daily basis. You don't know where the material came from. You don't know what it's made from. And oftentimes you don't know where it's going. Unless you're in Europe, they're wonderful at communicating material content. So from the beginning, we thought it's really important that you know Sway made this package and it's made from seaweed. This is the percentage of bio-based content. And this is where the product is supposed to go after you use it, into a home compost. Here's a QR code that you can scan to learn more about where the seaweed was cultivated and how to compost if you don't do that already. That's probably way too much information for most people. Most people don't read their package, they just unwrap it and they throw it away. But for the people who do care, I hope that information empowers them to get excited about the brand, their commitment to new materials, and the impact that they're now a part of as a shopper.
Oh, yeah. So the box system, is there like a Sway logo right now with the QR code?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I love that.
So on the back of every box and any package that we're a part of, there's the Sway logo. There's instructions on how to compost, how to recycle, and then there's a QR code that you scan and will give you information about the people who made the box, where the material is supposed to go, and even a feedback form so you can tell us how you like it.
Nice.
So right now, what store can I go to touch the seaweed film in the box system? What brand is using it and what products are they putting in there?
So you can purchase these boxes, like you, Erum, can purchase these boxes off of ecoenclosed.com, where they're just offered in stock. In our brand partnerships, our most recent collaboration was with a swimwear brand called Le Club. They're a men's swim trunk and resort wear company, and they're using our boxes to package their new line of swim, which is made with recycled bottles. So if you are interested in purchasing men's swimwear, you could get Sway packaging.
Maybe we'll do a giveaway.
There we go. I like it.
That's cool.
Well, why don't we talk about what's next for Sway? How do you see your impact growing in the broader context of reducing plastic pollution? And you guys just got some financing. Tell us the story.
Yeah, so we're really focused on scale of our first products. We have our flagship film, which is available in this retail box window. We have our thermoplastic seaweed resin, which is designed to go anywhere plastic goes. It's an ingredient for manufacturers to work with. And we have the first generation of our thermoplastic seaweed film, which is available in rolls or in the form of poly bags. Our vision for this year and the next is to really scale up production that we can service not just small brands, not just pilots, but actually full-scale activations with larger brands where our material and the positive impact for the seaweed farm and the divestment away from plastics would be meaningful. We just raised $5 million to do this. All of that new capital is going towards the scaling of our production and the broadened partnerships that we're developing with farms and brands.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on the funding. That's exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I'll also wrap it up because we do like to have some visioneering where we think about the future. And it sounds like you're newer to biotech, coming from the design world. But curious, now that you're CEO of this biotech company, you have been to biofabricate, you've been working in industry. Where do you see biotech going in the next 10 years?
I think that more people are going to have access to biologically derived solutions, not just in perhaps the more obvious categories, but in all aspects of life. And it's something that's been talked about, obviously, for decades. But this is the point in history where collective consciousness around the urgency of the climate crisis and the need for solutions and investment in nature and just very public outcry for let's please invest back into nature. We are not separate from nature. These types of narratives are mainstream. So I think in 10 years, our clothes are coming from biology. The food that we're eating is cultivated and designed in a way that's not creating as much harm. The materials that we're interfacing with on a daily basis, whether it's your shampoo bottle or it's your e-commerce package, are coming from generous feedstocks. What we're wearing is going to evolve. Every aspect of life, I think it's going to be more common that it's coming from a generous feedstock. That may sound lofty, but I think it actually is happening and could happen in 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful vision. And I think we're seeing exponential positive change happen. So I don't doubt your vision.
I am certainly going to purchase some of these boxes. I don't know what quantity they're coming in, like quantities of 10,000.
You can get a sample case of 25.
Okay, yeah, because I think it would be great to see, great to use and promote. I just think it's a beautiful product. And also, just to go on the website, I went on your website and it's beautifully designed, which I'm not surprised. I see the design elements inside and out across all of Sway's business presence. So just
Thank
wonderful.
you. Science needs great communicators. A lot of people think that these solutions are inaccessible or not for them because they don't understand them. But in truth, they're a lot more simple than a lot of people think, and they can be beautiful too.
Absolutely. Well, I think on that note, let's say thank you so much, Julia, for appearing on the Grow Everything podcast. It's really been a great conversation and look forward to running into you again soon.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
So, Karl, what did you think about the episode?
I said it before. One of the things that was really impressive to me about Sway and some of the other companies that I saw at Biofabricate was the way that they are fitting themselves into the existing plastic industry infrastructure. That was something that I had never seen at Biofabricate before. And I actually ended up learning a lot about the way the plastics industry works. So one of the things that Sway does is they produce these pellets that are made from seaweed. And those pellets can be put directly into that plastic industry infrastructure. This is really super important because the plastic packaging today, it's almost a $400 billion industry. And you're not going to change that if you don't present them alternatives that basically you can drop in. Drop in alternatives is the key. And I think that should be a message to other companies that are working with biomaterials. If there's an existing infrastructure, don't try to create it from scratch. We need to create infrastructure from scratch. But you can move faster if you could plug into existing infrastructure. What did you think, Erum?
Yeah, that's a very powerful perspective. I did share that point at the terrarium event that I went to, which was the alternative materials event in Bangalore. They really appreciated it. Actually, some of the attendees of the conference mentioned that point. They highlighted what the speakers were saying. And they're like, Erum talked about plastic pellets and a plug and play model for materials replacing plastics. The infrastructure's there, just tap into it and then slowly change infrastructure if it's needed. But this change has to happen today, not tomorrow, because of our plastic crisis. I'll just focus on plastic. Yes, it's part of climate, but specifically plastic. But yeah, I really appreciated that approach when she was thinking of like, okay, we're looking at seaweed, the farmers being very conscious of every decision and having that circular mindset.
Yeah, I mean, as we publish this podcast, Sway is making announcements. So they actually have two products that they're introducing. One is called TPC, which is 100% bio-based majority seaweed resin. Those are the pellets that are formed and put into finished plastic products. And then they also have TPC Flex, which is a film which is used to make poly bags. And those are actually being used by large retailers like J. Crew and Burton. Something that was super interesting was that she also mentioned that Charles Dimmler of Checker Spot is someone she's interacted with. Charles and Checker Spot were early guests on Grow Everything, and we're going to bring them back very soon.
Yeah, that's going to be exciting. Our exploration in biomaterials continues. I mean, this is the reason why we have this podcast, Grow Everything, right? And our world is full of different materials and ingredients. It's exciting to talk to these different founders and scientists and venture capitalists. I mean, that'd be a good thing to have on the pod. Who are the VCs that are funding these material companies and why? What do they see as a future? So that would be something we should also include in this conversation and exploration in biomaterials.
For sure. Well, I think unless there's anything else, I think that's a pod.
That's the pod. We have so many people engaging with us. We're excited to be sharing the pod on LinkedIn, on Instagram. But if you have a question or a recommendation for a guest or just a comment, maybe we got something wrong, or maybe there's something we didn't see, please reach out to us on the Grow Everything hotline. The number is in the show notes, but it's not just a phone call. You can text us. We've seen some people text us and ask us questions or point things out. So you can do that as well. We love to hear from you. And also don't forget to leave us a review. Please leave us a review. We would really, really appreciate it. Actually, if you commented to us and left a review, telling us you left the review, we'll send you a gift. How about that, Karl? I don't know what it is yet, but if you leave a review and you reach out to us on the hotline,
we'll send you a Grow Everything sticker.
Yeah. Yeah. So leave your address.
We do appreciate all of our listeners. And if you could just leave us a review, that does help the algorithm tremendously. That's the agreement. We do this for free. And if you enjoy it, just leave us a review. We appreciate it.
Yeah. That's the Grow Everything code.
Yeah.
That's Grow Everything code. Okay. So we can go on, but we will stop there. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
See you later.